Good evening. How's everybody doing this evening? Well, tonight we're going to finish our study of James. We're going to go over chapter 5. Chapter 5 has two major objectives in it. One of them is to learn the appreciation for the need for patience in times of oppression. The other one is to see the value of prayer and confessing sins in times of sickness. Now, the chapter summary goes as follows. The final chapter opens with a strong condemnation toward the rich who were oppressing the poor while living in pleasure and luxury. Most likely, these are rich unbelievers, such as those mentioned earlier in chapter 2. The Lord heard the cries of those defrauded, and judgment was to come upon the rich who had condemned and murdered the just. This passage may be an allusion to the destruction of Jerusalem foretold by Jesus in Matthew chapter 24 and fulfilled in AD 70. James counsels his brethren to patiently wait for the coming of the Lord and to establish their hearts, appealing to the farmer, the prophets, and to Job as examples of patience. He also warns against grumbling against one another and swearing rash oaths. That's the first 12 verses. Then, the last half of the chapter involves a call to prayer and praise. The suffering are to pray, the cheerful are to sing praises, and the sick are to call for the elders of the church. Their elders were to pray over the sick and anoint with oil in the name of the Lord. What is uncertain is whether the anointing was sacramental or medicinal. I think the latter. See the review questions later. In answer to the prayer of faith, the Lord has raised the sick and also forgives sins that they have committed. In this context, James encourages Christians to confess their sins to one another and pray for one another that they may be healed. He reminds them of the value of fervent prayer by the righteous, using Elijah as an example of how God answers prayer providentially. The epistle then closes with a reminder that turning a sinner from error of his way will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. So, beginning with the first 12 verses, the true religion displays patience under oppression. God's anger at the rich oppressors. The rich are called to weep and howl for the miseries to come upon them. Their riches are corrupted, their garments are moth-eaten, their gold and silver are corroded, which will be a witness against them, which will eat their flesh like fire. They have heaped treasure in the last days. The reason for God's anger against the rich is that they have defrauded the laborers who have mowed their fields, keeping back wages owed them. The cries of the reapers have been heard by the Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts. They have lived in pleasure and luxury, fattening their hearts in the day of slaughter. They have condemned and murdered the just, who does not resist them. Next, verses 7 through 12, a call for patience under oppression. Be patient until the coming of the Lord. Consider the patience of the farmer. Establish your hearers, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, lest you be condemned. The judge is standing at the door. Remember the examples of suffering and patience, such as the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord and are blessed for their endurance, such as the perseverance of Job, to whom the Lord proved very compassionate and merciful at the end. Above all, do not swear or make rash oaths, either by heaven or by earth or any other oath. Let your yes mean yes and your no mean no, lest you fall into judgment. Now the next set of verses, 13 through 20, talking about the true religion based through prayer, singing, and concern for the erring. The blessing of prayer and singing, 13 through 18. If anyone is suffering, let him pray. If anyone is cheerful, let him sing psalms. If anyone is sick, let him call for the elders of the church. Let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. The prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up. If he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. Confess your trespasses one to another, and pray for one another, that you may be healed. For the effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. The example of Elijah, a man with a nature like ours. He prayed that it would not rain, and no rain fell for 3 years. He prayed again, heaven gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. Now the verses 19 and 20, dealing with the blessing of love for the erring. And it talks about he who turns back one who wanders from the truth will save a soul from death. He prayed again, and he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will cover a multitude of sins. So now I'd like to go through the review questions of this chapter. Starting with the first question, what are the main points of the chapter? Again, the first 12 verses, true religion displays patience under oppression. And then 13 through 20, true religion blessed through prayer, singing, and a concern for the erring. Who is being condemned in verses 1 through 6? The rich, probably unbelievers who have been oppressing Christians. What sort of miseries were to come upon them? Their riches are to be corrupted, their garments moth-eaten, their gold and silver corroded, and serve as a witness against them. Such corrosion will eat their flesh like fire. Why is God so angry with these rich? They have heaped treasure in the last days. They have defrauded their workers by keeping back what is owed them. They have lived in pleasure and luxury, fattening their hearts. They have condemned and murdered the just, who does not resist them. What are the Christians to do in response to this oppression? And it tells us in 7 through 12, be patient until the coming of the Lord. Establish their hearts, for the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, for the judge is standing at the door. Do not swear, but make their yes be yes and their no be no. What 3 examples does James provide to encourage patience? This is 7 through 11. The farmer who patiently waits for the precious fruit of the earth, the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord, and the perseverance of Job. What does James encourage one to do when suffering? And one cheerful. To pray when suffering, to sing when cheerful. What is the one who is sick to do? Call for the elders of the church. What are they to do? They are to pray over the sick, anointing with oil in the name of the Lord. Is anointing with oil sacramental or medicinal? Some commentators say this anointing with oil is to be sacramental anointing, but others consider it a medicinal anointing. In defense of the medicinal anointing, Burdick wrote the following: there are a number of reasons for understanding this application of oil as medicinal rather than sacramental. The word anoint is not the usual word for sacramental or ritualistic anointing. James would have used herb chiro if they had been born to what he had in mind. The distinction is still observed in modern Greek. The alpheo meaning to daub or smear, or chiro meaning to anoint. Furthermore, it is well documented the fact that oil was one of the most common medicines in biblical times. See Isaiah 1:6, Luke 10:34. They report that during the last illness of Herod the Greek, was given a bath in oil of hopes effecting a cure. The papyri, Philo and Pliny, and the physician of Galen all refer to the medicinal use of oil. Galen described it as the best of all remedies for paralysis. It is evident then that James was prescribing prayer and medicine. Okay, number 11. What will save or heal the sick? Who will raise them up? The prayer of faith will heal the sick, and the Lord will raise them up. If the one who is sick has committed sin, he will be forgiven. That's verse 15. What are Christians to do and why? Verse 16. Confess sins one to another and pray for one another, that they may be healed. What avails much? Who is a good illustration of this? The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, and Elijah is a good example. Okay, number 15, the last review question. What happens when one turns a sinner from the error of his way? A soul is saved from death, and a multitude of sins is covered. So that's the book of James, all 5 chapters. And if you take a look at it, we've went through chapter by chapter, and it's a very practical book for modern day Christians. It tells us how we need to act, what we need to do, the things we need to remain steadfast in, to remain faithful in the Lord. So I appreciate you listening, watching, and that'll conclude the lesson for tonight.